Why did you move to Japan? Is a question that I get asked a lot. My friends at home ask me, and also my friends and colleagues in Japan. In this video, I want to answer that question and use this as a little bit of listening practice. At the end of the video, there will be some questions to see how much you understood, so make sure you stay to the end. So I lived in Japan for 16 years. So to start this story, we need to go back a few years. We're going to go back to 2003 when I graduated from university. My first job after university was in South America. I worked in Santiago in Chile, and I worked for an English language newspaper. I was the editor. I was the person who decided what articles would be used and which pages they would be on. I also had to write some articles for the newspaper myself. It was a fun job. It was a lot of responsibility for a young person, but I had a great time and managed to travel around a bit in Chile as well. And that was my first experience living in a very different culture. I'd been to America a couple of times, but I'd never spent a long period of time living in a very different culture, and also in a culture where the language was different. I had never studied Spanish at school. I'd studied a little bit of French, but Spanish was completely new to me. And this was an incredibly exciting experience. Every day there was something to learn, something new to discover, and to have that experience at a young age was really important. After my time in Chile, I came back to the UK. I worked for a local newspaper for a short time, and then I actually sold wine. I worked for a company that sold wine wholesale, which means that they sold wine by the box in large quantities. And that was a fun job. It was quite interesting learning about wine, but it was tough. It was long hours, and I heard about a job opportunity in London, and I applied for the job and I moved down to London. I worked for a student travel abroad company. So basically what we did was we helped students from the UK go to other countries for a working holiday, maybe for a summer or maybe for a year. So countries like America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, those were the most common countries we sent people to. But we also helped people come to the UK. And that's what I worked with mostly, is helping people once they arrived in the UK. Most of the people decided to stay in London. It's where a lot of jobs are and where a lot of people wanted to spend their time in the UK. And I had a great time. London is a very exciting city. For a young person, there's always something happening, concerts or exhibitions. There's always something to do. And also working with lots of other young people. It was a really fun time. But I still had this desire to travel. I had had this experience in Chile, and I was feeling a little bit restless in the UK. And one day I was talking to my colleague, and he told me about the program called the JET program. JET means Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. And this is a Japanese government program. The purpose of this program is to bring young graduates into Japan from different countries around the world, and they are placed at elementary schools, junior high schools around Japan. Usually not the big cities. More often they are sent to the countryside. And this sounded like a really good chance for me. In the back of my mind, I thought maybe one day I'd like to be a teacher. So the chance to travel a little bit and get some teaching experience seemed like a great opportunity. I didn't know much about Japan at all, if I'm honest. I knew about samurai and ninjas. I knew about Godzilla. I had never even tried sushi before. So Japan was really, really new to me. This was a long time ago. This is 2004, I think. So the internet was still kind of new, and there was no YouTube or Instagram or anything like that. So I really didn't know that much about Japan. Anyway, I applied, and a few months later, I was accepted. And I had 1 month to pack up everything in London, move all my belongings to my parents' house in the northwest of Scotland, and then get ready to leave for Japan. And I remember being at the airport, and I met some other people who were participating in the program, and we got on the plane and we flew to Tokyo. And I remember that flight thinking, I'm just going on holiday. This doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like I'm going to be living in this country for a year. That was the length of the contract I had. But when I arrived in Tokyo, very quickly it started to feel real. And the main reason for this was I was surrounded by the Japanese language, people speaking Japanese to me, and also Japanese writing everywhere. And that was a really big moment. I remember that moment very, very clearly. So we had a couple of days of orientation in Tokyo at a very nice hotel in central Tokyo. And during the orientation, they told us about things like what our job was going to be like, really, what our day-to-day life working at the schools was going to be like, and also some cultural tips. You know, for many of us, it was our first time visiting Japan, and what to expect, do's and don'ts, those kind of things. It was really important. And also in the evening, we had the chance to go out and explore Tokyo a little bit. And I remember going out in the evening, a hot summer evening in Tokyo. And first of all, you have the neon lights, all the streets in central Tokyo full of neon lights, and also the sounds of the cicadas. The cicada is an insect that makes a really, really loud noise, and it's a very distinctive summer sound in Japan. And walking around in this heat with all the chaos of central Tokyo, it was, again, a very, very memorable experience. After the orientation, I was taken to Tokyo Station and I was put on a train, a bullet train, and the train took about 2.5 hours to take me to Niigata in the countryside where I would be working. And at the train station, I met one of my new colleagues, and he drove me to the school where I would be teaching at. And even at that moment, there was lots and lots of new things for me to see. I remember seeing lots and lots of green fields, and I asked my new friend, my new colleague, what are they growing in those fields? And he looked at me as though I was completely stupid, and he said, rice? I didn't know that Niigata is a big producer of rice in Japan, and for him it's something he grew up with. But in Scotland, where I'm from, I'd never seen rice growing in a field, and it was everywhere. So even from a very, very basic level, things were new and interesting and exciting for me. So we arrived in the city where I was going to be living, and I met some of my new friends, people who were new teachers in the area. They had arrived just a few days before me, and we had some lunch together, and it was quite nice. And then I was taken to my school where I would be working, and I met the principal, the vice principal, some of the other teachers, and a few students. And then I was taken to my apartment where I was going to be living. The apartment was directly opposite the school. I could hear the school bell from my apartment. That's how close I was. And it was a small building, 4-apartment building, specifically for the teachers who worked at the school. And it was a very traditional Japanese apartment. We had the tatami floor, we had the paper screens, the sliding doors, all those kind of things. And I was left there to settle in, to unpack a little bit. And that night, I remember going to bed. I remember lying in my futon, and I could hear the crickets and I could hear the frogs, because all around the apartment was rice fields. And it was the summertime, so obviously the frogs and the insects, the crickets, were making lots of noise. And I remember lying in my futon thinking, what have you done? What have you done? Was this a good idea? You left London, where you had a very exciting social life. It was in the middle of an exciting city that you were living in. And now you're here in the deep countryside of a country that you know very little about. So it was a real 360-degree turn that I took. Like, what have you done? Was this a good decision? Long story short, I lived there for 3 years. And Niigata is very famous for winter sports, and I fell in love with snowboarding. So every winter during my 3 years, I would go snowboarding every Saturday and Sunday, and it was a real highlight of my experience. After those 3 years, I went back to the UK, and if you listen carefully at the start, you will have heard me say that I lived in Japan for 16 years. So I had another 13 years in Japan, and maybe that is a story for another video. And now here are some questions to test your listening skills. I didn't know much about Japan at all, if I'm honest. I knew about samurai and ninjas. I knew about Godzilla. I had never even tried sushi before. So Japan was really, really new to me. And I remember that flight thinking, I'm just going on holiday. This doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like I'm going to be living in this country for a year. That was the length of the contract I had. Niigata is very famous for winter sports, and I fell in love with snowboarding. So every winter during my 3 years, I would go snowboarding every Saturday and Sunday, and it was a real highlight of my experience.